Welcome back. This is our second podcast. I'm Jim.
And I'm Nick.
And we're glad that you're able to join us again. Nick, how you been doing?
I've been doing pretty well. How about you, Jim?
I'm doing just fine, just fine. I had a question going around in my mind over the weekend, though. Probably the same questions going through your mind. I know we chatted about it a few times.
I don't know if it was about what I had for Sunday supper, but...
That was the burning question that I was pondering all week. No.
It was a burning question, wasn't it?
It was a burning question.
Oh, no, I guess the question you're talking about was the name of a particular podcast.
The name of this mission, quest, thing. Yeah, we had a few interesting suggestions that came in. So, one of the big contenders was the men in sweaters or men in sweaters. That seemed to attract a lot of attention. You can see that I am in protest of that. I noticed that the assistant director of formation is not in communion with the director, but that's okay. Yeah, there was that one. Coffee room conversations was one. Oh, that was added by Nick Pirlo. That got a few votes of support. A little wayward. That was Christian Bacole. A few support there. Knit sweater conversations was there. The Director's Cup, coffee room convos, wayward conversations. The Nick and Jim show, a little waywards. Some plays on words happening here, which is interesting. Little conversations. A late edition came from Clark Jamin, which I think deserves some honorable mention on this one. The Jiminy Nicket show. I thought that was quite clever.
Yeah, that's a lot of fun. Yeah, I quite enjoyed that one too.
A rare wit, but I think we did settle on something though in the end, didn't we? After some discussion and debate.
Yeah, I think it ended up being the third contender.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah, so kind of correlating with Catherine Doherty, I am third. I guess we went with A Little Wayward. Yeah. So Jim, why did we go with A Little Wayward, do you think?
Well, I don't know, Nick. Why did we go with A Little Wayward?
Well, I guess the question becomes what word we're playing on with wayward.
With wayward. Well, I don't know. I think I like it because it's a good play on words, and it's the little way, and it's Saint Therese, and there's that part of it. There's also that sense of always just being a little bit off balance. I know in my own walk, my own journey, depending on who you talk to, I'm just a little bit left of center, a little bit of right of center, just depending where it is. Sometimes I think that's good. It means you're kind of walking in the middle.
Mm-hmm. No, I like the word because, frankly, you and I tend to get off on tangents anyways.
We often do get off on tangents. There's another big reason for it, too.
Yeah. No, so I think that there's something very fitting in terms of the personality. I like even just the way we did some wordplay there. A little way, St. Therese Institute.
And that's probably the key on it, Nick, is that, even our conversation here is a little bit wayward, because when you get to the heart of it, it really is words of support and encouragement along the little way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's exactly it. So I think there's a lot fitting with that title. At first when I heard it, I wasn't exactly a huge fan of it, but just for some reason. But over the weekend, I just prayed about it and let it sink in, and it's now become quite natural. So I take that as a good sign.
I do want to just mention to the sweaters and all of those that were supporting the sweaters, it was a fun name. I think that was very much unique to this year. I think you and I had this thing going where we would sometimes be wearing the same kind of sweater, and that became a little bit of buzz among the students this year, which was kind of fun. So,
yeah, you and I seem to have the similar sweater taste, or maybe we just go shop the same sales. I'm not sure.
I have a feeling it's probably the latter more than the former. That's wonderful. So what were you doing over the weekend, Nick?
Oh, what was I doing over the weekend? Well, this weekend I was pretty much holed up at home with Denise and my family. Spent a lot of time just chatting with Denise about various things coming up. I've been getting into making some sourdough bread or starting a sourdough starter, and that's proven to be quite a thing. I think it's dead. I'm not sure. I think I might have accidentally killed it.
You made some sourdough ender.
Yeah, sourdough ender. And and then I just played a few board games, taught Denise my favorite board game, and then just got into a little bit of reading and got out for a walk or two, just trying to relax and to treat the Lord's Day as such.
Yeah, I was finding that too. It's interesting as I'm chatting with folks, you realize, and just checking in the social media, you realize there's a lot of people in this time of isolation or containment that are finding a lot of time And that can be problematic at first, it seems. You start getting a bit restless and listless. I think there's also a great opportunity in this, the opportunity to rediscover some hobbies. I know I've heard some folks that are turning their hand to things. There's all sorts of stuff online about learning how to do, well, shoot, what did I see just the other day was a photography course being offered for free, art courses, learning how to sketch, all of those kind of interesting things. And I know our friend Sarah de Nordwall is talking about an online bard school, so a little bit of writing stuff. And there's a great opportunity to rediscover things that maybe we haven't done in a while, these hobbies and these interests, because we got time. Time on our hands.
Yeah, I know. We've got suddenly tons of free time, or maybe it's forced free time. It's paradoxically.
Forced free time. It's funny we talk about free time because I know for myself, I've always been a little bit concerned about the term free time because of the emphasis on free. That somehow it's like this bonus time that I can do whatever I want with it. And I think there's an element to that. I prefer the notion of personal time. The opportunity to kind of invest in being a person, becoming more human, doing things that build upon that. And I think the law of the gift is always something that should be in there. I don't know if we were chatting earlier and you had some interesting notions on this.
And I think what you've just outlined is our topic for today. We're going to be getting into some concept of what is free time, really. And it touches on questions of leisure, of contemplation, of recreation, all those kinds of activities, or activities, is that the proper word? We'll see in a minute. For myself, I knew the topic of this podcast over the weekend, and I was really thinking about it because on the topic of leisure, I looked up an old book that I had read whenever I was doing my master's degree. It's called Leisure, the Basis of Culture by a German philosopher named Joseph Pieper. This is one of those little gems in philosophy that you find that once you read it, it's hard not to be changed by it. There are certain books like that. For me, one of them is actually Saint Therese of Lisieux. She's changed my life radically. That book as well. But in that book, it really got to the concept of basically what is free time? What does freedom mean in this regard? And really, he makes the startling claim that all of our work and all of our human endeavors is really ordered to one thing, which is leisure. All of our activities through the week is trying to achieve the one thing, which is leisure.
Interesting, and in salvation history, we think of that at the very beginning. These 6 days of creation, these 6 days of work that were all ordered to and leading to the Sabbath rest. And the Hebrew word for rest meaning blessing. So there's a blessedness in that rest, which is more than simply not doing anything. It seems to me that we can even fill that time of rest with activity. You were saying that earlier, just activity. We can be busy about trying to rest, and it ends up not being rest at all.
No, it's so true. It's so true, and I fall into that trap a lot. And I think a lot of us do honestly fall into that trap, because I know for myself as a young man, one of the things that I struggled with as a teenager was laziness, boredom, and a general lethargy, like this hesitance to really develop myself. And then whenever I started doing my master's degree and dating Denise, dating someone is a lot of motivation to improve yourself, by the way. I will say that. I won't say too much more about that. That's a little too much. But one of the things that I found myself when I started trying to get into self-development is you get worn thin after a while. And whenever you have, say, a Sunday, if you feel this general anxiety about constantly improving and constantly adding another thing on the schedule. In university, I was constantly filling up my Sunday afternoons with studying and such. That's not a problem if it's necessary work, as the church says. But there is this general anxiety in our time, which I've kind of noticed. And that's one of the things that Joseph Pieper in this book really begins to unpack. Where is this coming from? Because he describes the ancient mind, and when I say ancient, I mean it rather broadly. I think anywhere from the medieval philosophers down to Plato, Aristotle, but as you say as well, God in the book of Genesis.
Yeah.
In fact, Benedict XVI and John Paul II call the first, that section in Genesis where God looked upon all he had made and saw it was very good, and then went into the Sabbath as the foundation of culture.
It's an interesting thing too, because it sounds as from what you're saying that there's this juxtaposition between work and rest, and how easy it is for us to fill the time of rest with simply another form of work. One of the phrases that comes to my mind is written by T.S. Eliot, the English poet, in the Four Quartets, and he says, "We are distracted from distraction by distraction." And we think on the summer times, our leisure time in the summer up at the cabin or at the lake is often so full of just more busyness. So just the juxtaposition of work and rest. I wonder if you might just speak a little bit on that.
Work and rest. Well, it's interesting to note that leisure is very different from work. And when I'm referring to work, I'm referring to basically three things, and I'm getting this directly from Joseph Pieper. He refers to work as activity. He also refers to work as toil or exertion, this strenuous element of work. And then he refers to work as social usefulness, delivering products, having a 5-year plan, all this kind of stuff. And whenever we talk about work, it's not a bad thing. The problem is when we begin to see this as the only thing. And I think that for us in our modern society, we have a lot of reasons why we view work in such a high regard, and non-activity or non-toil or non-social usefulness in such a suspicious light. If you think of the Enlightenment, which is a philosophical time period, which was about from the 17th century up until, I would say a lot of the strains are still with us, but it's no longer the Enlightenment. We're more post-Enlightenment now. There is this general focus on the activity of the human being their defining attribute. So one German philosopher, Immanuel Kant, said that the most properly mode of human knowing is discursive reasoning. So this mode of being really intensely involved in unfolding something before you. Whenever it's this notion of dissecting. Something in front of you, and that's the only way you can come to knowledge. You have Karl Marx, who overemphasizes the proletariat, the working class, as the primary citizen. And of course you have Friedrich Nietzsche, who created this image of the human being as being the supremely willful individual. And he thought that all inactivity of humanity was something properly alienating and causing resentment and all the rest. So you have like this general environment going on in modern culture, secular culture, and because the church is in the world, we find ourselves kind of with this anxiety as well. And even we can find this in catechesis too, whenever we emphasize the activities of the saints from time to time. The activities, the holy works are important. But sometimes we can find ourselves being discouraged because if you get more deeper into it, we're like Saint Therese. I can't do that, I can't go and do this thing. I have desire to be this thing. And so then you feel like you're somehow left out, So leisure is not activity, it's not toil, and it's not about social usefulness. Rather, it's the way Pieper describes it is it's almost like vision, It's a quiet looking upon things. It's different than observation. Scientific observation is where you're notating, you're taking things down, you're rigorously kind of grappling with the thing you're seeing. But leisure is really about this restful, calm, watching a child play, for example. You're just beholding.
It seems to me, even that the term that you're mentioning many times is activity. At the core of that is the active life, and there's great tension, especially in our Western mind, our Western heart. And I wonder how much of that is because we take our identity in productivity. We take our value in what we produce for the good of society. Think of that as something that in this day and age is very prevalent beneath many of the life issues that we would deal with. What is the value of life, and what is their life value going to be? So often that's tied into productivity, activity. So it's like activity has become this secular social virtue at the expense of, well, we would say the contemplative life. It brings to mind the writings of Pope Francis, and he identifies this tension as well between the active and the contemplative. The fact of the matter is we need both. We can think of the figures of Martha and Mary, who capture the active and the contemplative, and the need for both in the richness. And I think there's a beautiful order in our lives. If we recognize the Lord's Day, that should be catechizing us in this importance of rest, of contemplation. As you say, just being able to look in wonder on children playing.
Yeah, no, and that's so important. The main thing that kind of gets me is why we do that. You know, why do we need leisure is one of the biggest questions. Even for someone who enjoys playing like video games or something like that, there's a certain leisurely element to it, you know. But like whenever you find someone being not playing video games and they're used to doing that, usually you'll have someone like being bored or listless or restless. Listless and restless, this actually relates to what the medievals will call acedia.
Sloth.
Sloth and acedia, they seem to draw a distinction between the two.
Okay.
Which is interesting. Sloth is, they would say, an indifference to reality, or like this, it's neither here nor there. Acedia,
Whatevs.
whatever's, yeah, or whatever, you know.
The meh.
The meh of the ancient world, yeah. Yeah, oh, that's good, I'm going to use that. But acedia, on the other hand, Thomas Aquinas, and I thought this was powerful, it
can go to the other extreme, can't it?
It can go from indifference to downright rejection, too.
Or to the filling life with incredible busyness and being, essentially, it's a form of distraction.
Oh, exactly. And what's fascinating is acedia will both cause someone to be driven to distraction, because it's a sorrow of the world of what the way it is. It's rejection of reality, in a sense. It's discontentment, taken to a decision, is what acedia leads to. So you find someone leading themselves to distract completely from reality, which leisure, Joseph Pieper says, like, it's not about escaping reality primarily.
Yes. Yeah.
It's about appreciating, and actually in his words, affirming it, to celebrate reality. And so he connects this to the festival. He connects this to Christian liturgy too, which is really cool. But it also can drive us to this nonchalant whateverness, you know, where it's just like, I don't need to do a thing, you know. So acedia, you know, and even the Benedictine rule, whenever Benedict put it out there, he said that acedia was to be reprimanded very seriously when they found it, because even if it was a small thing, it would lead to such disastrous problems. So acedia for us in our time, I think, is something we see very much.
So in what forms do you see it taking shape?
Well, I think, well, even for me, on the weekend, I had an acedia kind of afternoon on Saturday. And so this listlessness, this restlessness, and this discontentment was kind of regarding a few withdrawals from just various ways of distracting myself I had. But I see it also in just a lot of people nowadays who are becoming resentful. Acedia does lead to resentment in some way, because that's what its core is. It's a sorrow over reality that's not constructive. It actually ends in cynicism. So I actually wonder if a lot of youth in our day, when we see a lot of this cynicism, we're seeing a lot of acedia in there, because they are reaching a discontentment about life.
Could you clarify what you mean by that?
What I mean by that?
Articulate it maybe a different way, yeah, just to make clear that sense of the listlessness, the indifference, which is a form of acedia.
Gotcha. Well, sloth would be just simple indifference, from what I've said. And then acedia, to the best of my knowledge, is going from that simple indifference to actually a choice, or the involvement of the will in the thing, to actually foster sorrow about the world, as Thomas Aquinas would say. So I'd say, like with a lot of youth, like studies are showing that the youth of the last 20 years or so, I think, what is it, Generation Y or Z or whatever it is, I don't even know the lingo, are turning into one of the most cynical generations. They're some of the most suspicious about authority. They're some of the most suspicious about meta-narrative, or grand story, grand depictions of the universe. And I wonder if a good chunk of this is coming from discontentment of reality. Number one, from Augustine's restless heart, let's put it that way, where they've had a glut of stuff promised to them in commercials, in advertisements, in dreams and hopes and desires that have been smushed. And instead of actually seeing these things as meaning we have a desire for more,
and pressing into that
and
ache,
pressing into that,
to avoid the ache then.
yeah, to avoid the ache. So a sorrow over the state of the world. But it's not a constructive sorrow.
Right.
It keeps it at arm's
Which
length.
sounds like it's very, very different than that beautiful beatitude, which is, blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. So that's a mourning, which is a sorrow, not for the world, but for, a sorrow, that mourning that is the desire for what the world could be. Which seems to me that's actually very much tied into contemplation, because contemplation is a way of actually, well, as we were discussing last week, the sacramental imagination, seeing how things might be, could be, should be, and actually leaning towards that.
Oh, the two are definitely connected. But what would you say, how would you kind of describe contemplation in the way that we're using it here?
In the way that we're using it here, I think it is that developing that sense of wonder. I think it's actually very closely tied to those gifts of the Holy Spirit, fear of the Lord, which we tend to interpret in maybe Jansenistic norms of, God's wrath and that fear like that. But that's not what it is. It's actually that deep sense of wonder at the glory of God. And von Balthasar would tie in the glory of God with beauty. And so I think it is very much that recognition of the true, the good, the beautiful around us, particularly the beautiful, which will draw us into that sense of contemplative wonder. We speak about those moments in a Way of Beauty class. We speak about those moments of being pierced by beauty, of actually being drawn into a place of ecstasy, ecstasis, where we are beyond ourselves. When we're beyond ourselves, we have the opportunity then to touch something that is transcendental, something that is beyond. And I think that's really what contemplation leads us to. I think it's learning to have that mystical sense of things. The sacramental imagination we were talking about last week. There's a way. It's not just what you're doing, but it's the way that you're doing it. So much of the little way is that, right? It's not what you do, but how you do it. So you can watch kids playing, or you can behold children playing, and maybe it's that sense of beholding which opens you up to receive something deeper. And it may actually be the root of that. Our activity is rooted, I believe, in our fallen human nature often, not always, but it can be, where we're seeking to grasp, often rooted in a form of pride. I was speaking a while back about concupiscence, which is that inordinate desire, the disordered desire, which is often born, always born really, from pride. That sense that I can sort this out for myself. But irascibility is another part of that. That's the anger, and I wonder how much irascibility is tied into what you're speaking of about that sense of sorrow for the world as it is, and the cynicism. I think cynicism and irascibility, anger, is rooted in that. Wonder, I think, is like a cool shower, a cool rain that just dampens the dust and slows everything down a little bit and allows things to grow deeper. In Way of Beauty, not Way of Beauty, in critical thinking, one of the early assignments that I give to the students is to go on a wonder wander, and simply go out on a 15 or 20-minute walk and see things that you've seen before in a new way. And that can be a hard work and effort to actually become receptive. If we're able to do that, and children show us how to do that so beautifully, because everything is fresh and new to a child. For us, we have become jaded. So I think all of those aspects are contemplation, and ultimately contemplation, as with every encounter with beauty, should be leading us into reverence for the Creator. The blessed rest of the seventh day is simply to be resting after work in the presence of the Creator. And that Sabbath rest, I think, is something that should be spilling over into every aspect of our life. And with the gifts of the Spirit, I think will also come the fruits of the Spirit. I think it's leisure, this understanding of leisure, recreation, which will really be a beautiful means of fostering and nurturing those fruits of the Spirit in our life.
No, I thought that was excellent, the way you described contemplation there. In fact, I would argue that the attitude used for leisure, achieving leisure, and contemplation, they're actually almost two sides of the same thing. Because when you think about contemplation, even in spiritual terms, whenever we are trying to contemplate God in prayer, there's this notion of quieting your inner self. You know, you're trying to allow the storms and the seas just to be and let be, and not cling to solving this or solving that. You're trying to set up fertile ground in your heart, and that often would be what the setting for leisure would be, which is this rest, this letting things go, and allowing reality to be as it is. That's really one of the fundamental attitudes of leisure, and that's receptivity, allowing it to be as it is, and within that is the affirmation. And so with contemplation, you are directed to the true, the good, and the beautiful because you affirm them as such. You affirm that these are worthy, these are valued.
The amen of life.
The amen of life, so be it. And that's wonderful. And that attitude is at the heart of the festival, you know, or the celebratory cultural event. You know, the whole point of a festival is, there's a reason why we have it around harvests, you know, historically and traditionally. You know, there's a lot of work in the harvest, but afterwards you celebrate what was and the fruits of the earth, you know. This is a giant affirmation of reality. So leisure, in a sense, is always connected to work, you know. But it's precisely not done for the sake of work. It's to celebrate what's been done in work as well as everything else.
I think how that could actually be part of our daily lives surrounding meals. So often with meals, we've lost that sense of family celebration, of coming together to actually be in awe of the work that has been done, and allowing this to be a little rest and a little festival, a little celebration. Those moments of celebration are so important. As you were speaking, I was thinking, of course, of one of my favorite scriptures, which is, if you abide in me, if you rest in me, remain in me, make a home in the Word, you will truly be my disciples. You'll know the truth, and the truth will set you free. That seems to speak very deeply of this notion of contemplation. But a thought I'd like to explore a little bit, and this is tying into our last conversation about the sacramental imagination, and this is the balance between escape, which I think is important and has a very important place, and I think leisure provides a place for escape from escapism. And I wonder how much boredom plays into that. When I'm bored, I am looking not just for escape, but an escapism, because I'm bored with the way things are. Escape, as Tolkien, I think, would describe it in his essay on fairy stories, is being able to step aside from reality, to see reality in a new perspective, in a new way, and that's the power of myth. Speaking of myths, as we ponder this, sometimes you can't look at something directly, you have to look at it as in a mirror, and it calls to mind, I think we were talking about this a couple of weeks ago, the myth of, was it Perseus and Medusa, the Gorgon?
Yeah, I'm not sure if we were. But,
okay. Well, maybe it was somebody else I was chatting with. But the notion that, you know, the Gorgon, Medusa, anybody that looked directly at her would be turned to stone. And yet this great hero was able to cut off her head, to slay this by looking in the shield. And so sometimes we can see reality more clearly in order to deal with it by looking at it obliquely. And I think there's the power of leisure and recreation that provides us that opportunity to contemplate truth, goodness, and beauty, so that we can become re-engaged. It's the essence of what a retreat is to withdraw in order to re-engage.
And you know, the funny thing is too, is it's a curious thing, because it's easier said than done in so many ways. Because it's very true that if you enter into an activity of leisure, there you go, it's almost paradoxical. If you actually enter into something...
about resting.
Get busy about resting, yeah, that's very true. Anyways.
That's like that joke about the dog named Stay. Eh? Come here, Stay. Come here, Stay.
Exactly. But it's funny, one of the things that I personally find difficult about leisure is precisely I tend to always go into leisure not treating it as leisure, this resting of the mind and beholding of the thing. I tend to treat it like a break, which is very different because a break is always in the context of work. It's to refresh you for the work to come. Leisure will refresh you for the work to come, but you don't go into leisure primarily for the end of work, you know.
You go into leisure for leisure's sake.
You go into leisure for leisure's sake.
And I wonder how much of that is about recreation, which is really recreation, about being created anew.
Oh, I think it is. It's fundamental.
So I wonder if you have some practical thoughts on what this would look like and how could we live this way, especially in this time when we do have a lot of free time on our hands, unstructured time.
Yeah, I've been thinking about that. And I think I've got more questions than I do answers at this point, because this is a journey I'm on as well. But I think that a good deal of it would be to learn how to give thanks in the middle of this time. St. Paul says, give thanksgiving in all things. And I think what he's talking about is maybe not fully, but I think it's totally connected to this question of leisure and contemplation. In the midst of every single adversity, there is cause to celebrate the world in some way, because that is the great affirmation. The world is created true, good, and beautiful. And so fostering that mystical vision is so important. And I think one of those big things is to give thanksgiving, or to have an attitude of gratitude, as the colloquial saying goes on. So one thing I would say is that there's an incredible opportunity in the midst of all this free time for dedicated prayer time. That's one big thing, I would say.
Yeah.
Another one I would say is going to maybe some more traditional media of reading books, or taking in like a movie or something like that. Reading a play if you're ambitious and you have the people around you. That's always fun. Those are great, but also to approach these things not so much as a self-improvement schema, as trying to find rest and rejuvenation. And I think with that, there needs to be a certain sense of testing the fruits. If you see something, if you're doing something that's objectively good, or good to do, and it's a leisurely activity, whether someone told you about it or not. I mean, that's how we learn a lot. And you're actually seeing it's causing negative effects in yourself. Then the problem is either with the thing you're doing, or the way you're doing it. And the way I'm doing things is actually one of my big things right now.
Yeah. And we were speaking of that earlier. A couple of things that I would throw in. I would agree with you that gratitude is first and foremost. Gratitude leaves us in a place of openness and receptivity, because we're thankful for that which we have received, which allows us to be in a posture of deeper receptivity. So I would say receptivity is key in this. And then, as you were just mentioning, it's not what we do, but how we do it. We were speaking about that before. It's being attentive to the duty of the moment, being grounded in the moment, and being open to receive, again, that receptivity, but being in the moment. And I think living the vocation to love, I think living the little way is a profoundly contemplative way of life. And it allows us to receive each moment as full of the presence of God. It's an amazing thing how you can actually do dishes in a contemplative way. And maybe that's part of praying always. Good. Just maybe move the conversation a little bit. As you're speaking about reading plays and reading works, we mentioned a movie last week, and an interesting one. I think we both had the chance to watch it. But Groundhog Day, what'd you think of it?
What a crazy movie. To be fair, I went into it with a bit suspicious of it, because I don't know,
cynical, perhaps?
A little cynical,
Skeptical?
maybe. My aesthetic tastes are, I don't like I never liked the cover of it, and I heard it was a really good movie, and judging a book by its cover, totally guilty in this case. And I went into it, and I was pleasantly surprised. I was really struck by that movie. It took a twist that I never saw coming. And I thought the ending message was totally profound. So I was watching it with my wife Denise, and then at the end of the movie, we were both like, "That was a good movie." And there's actually quite a few different movements going on in it too. So, how did you like the movie?
I loved it. I'd seen it years and years and years ago. So it was seeing it again with very new eyes. But I think in light of our conversation about leisure and contemplation, I think that was very central to the whole thing, because you could see the main character, Phil Connors, moving from being very cynical, very selfish, very enclosed in his own world, to really going through these stages of growth. And we can look at those stages, but going through those stages to finally being very open to life and really making the disinterested gift of self. But in light of that notion, you were talking about reading a play or reading, and there's that. He does that in these stages. He does that at first to impress this woman. But there's one scene, and it's a smaller scene, but there's one scene that really stuck out in my mind. And it's on this day that he's living over and over and over, Groundhog Day, living over, caught in this eternity of the same day, and what he learns by this same day. But there's one scene where he's in a restaurant reading, and you can see that something happens in his heart that all of a sudden draws him out and open. It's a very short scene. It's only a few seconds, but he's reading an old book. So it could be a play, or it was French poetry, I think, that he was trying to impress the woman with. But he's reading this, and you can see that he's drawn into that, and then through that he's drawn out, because all of a sudden he looks up from the page, and he looks with this half smile on his face at everything that's going around him. And it's almost as if he is seeing all of the people around him as they are for the first time, rather than as he's always thought they were.
And that's something worth mentioning, because in the beginning of the film, he hates that town.
And the people.
And the people.
And all people.
And all people.
And his
and
life.
The groundhog. Poor groundhog. There's a fiery incident with a truck in the middle of it. Yeah, it was a really cool scene. But
Although no animals were harmed in the making of this film.
yeah, exactly. I don't know if that was said in the credits. I don't know if they cut that. It was before PETA. But anyways, one of the things that I noticed that shift. There was something curious about that, but another part of the film that was really, you saw a big shift that really shattered his self-centeredness, I thought, was his rejection by the lady when he was trying to seduce her in the first place. The hardest catch, couldn't catch her, not on his own terms. He worked really hard for that. Number two, there was an old man he had met in the street. Every day, and one day he took him into a restaurant and fed him and all that kind of stuff, and then he found out that night he died, and so he
worked so hard day after day to prevent him from.
Yeah, and he worked so hard day after day to prevent him from dying, but then what happened is he realized this man was going to die because it was old age, and so I couldn't help but think of the old phrase "memento mori," remember your death. And we even have Saint Therese of Lisieux pining for her own death in her autobiography, Story of a Soul. And the reason for that is not so much this weird, twisted psychological state, like suicidal state. No, it's actually like this recognition of there's so much more outside of my own little bubble. And so Saint Therese was precisely craving life. That's what she was doing. And so this experience of death for Phil Connors, I think, brought him out of this tight egocentric bubble and made him realize that even though I'm rehearsing this day over and over again, he suddenly saw something of value that he tried to save.
Yeah.
He got suddenly brought out of a different role. He got brought out of the cynic and into the lover, or someone who cares.
And I think it is that movement from cynic to lover that's so important. It's interesting, as you're speaking, Nick, I'm thinking about that other character that is in there all the time, his old high school buddy, who's an insurance salesman and selling him insurance against accident and death, which he seems to be unable to get to, but it's his encounter with the death of the old man that really does kind of start to bring him out. It's a huge step. And death factors in hugely in this. And one of the thoughts that was occurring to me as I was watching it is reminiscent very clearly of John Paul II's thinking in Fides et Ratio, that the encounter with the meaningless life, the sense of nihilism, that there is no clear meaning to life, will manifest in one of two ways. It was interesting, as I was reading it, I was thinking of one of the early, or not reading it, when I was watching the movie, thinking of one of the early conversations that we have in critical thinking class of if there's no meaning to life, if life is fundamentally meaningless, then it's going to manifest either as a grab for absolute power. I can do whatever I want with complete impunity, no consequences. But I will find that that's very empty, and then I'll turn to self-destructive behavior. And that's certainly what Phil Connors does, is he has that moment in the bar, in the bowling alley, with those two guys, and he says, what if you were just you were trapped and living the same day over and over and over. You were completely helpless, and nothing that you did made any difference. And the guy's like, yeah, tell me about it. And you realize that he's reflecting back to this other person what the life of just laborious work is, that is without any sense of growing in humanity and grace and nobility. It's just the mundane, everybody's working for the weekend, which is just another form of work on the weekend, just escaping from work, not that real rest. And then the reflection back is, well, if that's how it is, then you can do anything you want. So that's what Phil Connors does. He starts grasping, through money, the possessions, craving after the sexual intimacy, all of those kind of things that he's going after just to possess it, that grabbing. And that comes up empty because it's just this endless cycle of consuming. And so he ends up trying to kill himself, which he can't do either.
Yeah, he finds several creative ways to kill himself, none of which work.
And I think there's that pattern. So from the hedonism into the self-destruction, and then he slowly starts to open, and he starts to realize that he can live for others. And the way he starts to live for others is actually by trying to improve himself. So he takes the piano lessons, he does that. But eventually he has this great transformation. Rather than just trying to grow in his own virtue, he actually starts to make the gift. And that notion of the disinterested gift of self, I think there's one scene that really captures that so beautifully, and it's when he goes on his errands around the town to help everybody. And there's little old ladies in the car, and he's right there. But it's that one about the boy who's about to fall from the tree, and he looks at his watch, and he realizes he's going to be late, and he runs to go and catch up, and he's there just in time to catch this kid that falls out of the tree, and he says, "Yeah, you're welcome." And the kid runs off and doesn't thank him. And he says, "Well, you won't thank me. You didn't thank me again. You always do that, But you see, being able to do that and desiring to do that, even in the sense of thanklessness, is that disinterested gift of self. And it brought to mind Aristotle's understanding of doing the right thing at the right time in the right way is how we actually are really open in virtue. And starting to make that disinterested gift of self. I think it's a beautiful movie about learning the law of the gift.
Oh yeah, and I think that it was very explicit at the end. Whenever spoilers for the end of the movie, when he finally gets the girl, quote unquote, he doesn't get her by clinging for her. He actually says to her in the course of the evening, I'm perfectly fine. That we could restart it all over tomorrow and it'd be okay,
Yeah.
And I can let you be and it's totally fine. I'm totally paraphrasing here. But I just thought that he had come to a place of peace, of rest with everything. He had this enjoyment of reality. And whenever he actually wakes up the next day and sure enough, the cycle's broken, and
she's there beside him.
And she's there beside him and it's wonderful. They go out of the house and he says, "Oh, let's live here."
Yeah.
Which is such a contrast from the beginning of the movie. And I think it really, for our purposes, like leisure, it's a celebration of what is. He had this journey from totally resenting this small town stuffiness, which even you had a sense of at the beginning of the film, to all of a sudden he knew the story of everyone in town. And he knew each person so well, and he celebrated their reality by even wanting to be there. And that's accompaniment in many ways, seeing the value.
Which I believe is probably what he was looking for all along. That Anthony Welsh quote that we always speak of, what is it that crushes the human spirit? It's not the fear of illness, poverty, or even death. It's the fear of being alone and unloved in the universe. And that's what he's craving from the beginning. It's what he discovers in the end, but he only discovers it through that disinterested gift of self. The other thing I noticed about that last scene, how he breaks the cycle, is by actually loving that disinterest. And it's the feminine genius that draws it out. It's the woman that he's been trying to connect with. In fact, he's been trying to get the woman all the time. But in the end, you realize that, the cycle was broken. they wake up in bed together, and yet nothing happened the night before, which is a beautiful thing.
Yeah, no, it was...
that disinterested gift of self.
Yeah, beautiful and striking.
So what do you think? That was a good movie. I enjoyed that one. Here we are in Holy Week. So what would you suggest for our next viewing? I think there's really only kind of one choice that works on this one.
Yeah. Well, at the risk of being predictable, we would suggest for the next movie, The Passion of the Christ.
Yeah.
I'll probably watch it on Good Friday.
Yeah. I remember seeing this movie in the theaters when it first came out. There was a lot of hype about it at the time. This is Mel Gibson. He was taking a major step, being so overtly religious, and there was a lot of people that thought it was going to tank. It was incredible, but I do remember driving about an hour and a half, 2 hours to the theater where it was showing to see it. This was back in Ontario, and going in, there was all of the chatter about a movie, everybody in there with their popcorn and pop, and at the end of the movie, everybody coming out dead silence, carrying out their popcorn and pop. So it's not a popcorn movie, it's a serious movie, and my encouragement in this one would be, I don't know how you're mentioning watching it on Good Friday. I like to watch this one in the form of making a Stations of the Cross and really entering into the Paschal mystery. Maybe, as we were speaking about earlier, entering into it with that contemplative spirit, but very powerful images. Would you have some lens through which you'd like to watch this time?
Well, I can tell you what I've always appreciated. I've always appreciated seeing Jesus and Mary in that film.
Yeah.
There's a very real, tangible intimacy between those two. And you see a Christ who's a bit playful as well. There's a couple of scenes that I think of in particular. So maybe I would just suggest maybe looking at that and beholding it, if you will, and just carrying that into your prayer, because it's helped me quite a bit. And we'll talk about it next week. Beautiful.
Right on. Excellent. Thanks. So I'm wondering, Nick, I'm interested in what your thoughts are on a certain subject here.
Now it's time for that part of the show.
So a couple of questions that came up here.
Sure.
May I ask you one?
Oh, yes. Age before beauty. Yeah.
Again, I think you said that last time.
Yep. I'll keep saying it.
Good. I resembled that comment. So here's a question from Louise Fournier for you.
Okay.
Nick, who are the saints in your squad? Meaning the saints that you've had a closer relationship to and who've journeyed close with you.
Oh, gosh. Well, I think one I have to mention is Padre Pio. Considering that his feast day is on my birthday, he's always kind of haunted me in that regard. No, he's really been a mover and shaker in my life for various things. Saint Therese of Lisieux has had her eye on me for a long time. I would also argue Saint Joseph. He pops his face around more often than not. In terms of people that I regularly pray to, it would be Saint Jose Maria Escriva. Impacted me very greatly when I was trying to improve myself and try and be a good Christian in the marketplace. Catherine Doherty, of course. Can't not mention Saint Augustine and Thomas Aquinas, especially in study. Yeah, and there's definitely more, but I think that's a good enough list for now.
It sounds like you got a devotion to all saints there.
Well, yeah, let's just put it this way. When at the end of the day, when Denise and I pray, we say all angels and saints. And that covers all angels and saints pray for us. It works.
Good.
Okay, so here's a question for you, Jim. And this one's from Amy Mishak. Could you describe your experience of living an ordinary yet truly mystical life and one moment that has called you deeper into mysticism during this time?
Well, Amy, I think that would probably require a lifetime of explanation. We've been striving to grow in that way. It's hard to put your finger on one moment in particular, certainly in the context of what we've been discussing, the contemplative life and living with that sense of wonder that's been good. But I think the thought that comes to my mind right now is actually a very early one, and how we carry these childhood experiences that can be deeply informative. We were talking about literature, different books that influenced us last week. There's a book from my childhood that it's actually in my office called Varenka. And I don't think I've realized until recently as I look back, just how deeply it impacted me with a sense of wonder in God's providence and very, very childlike trust. And I think the contemplative spirit is born from the childlike yet mature soul, growing up by growing little. So I think that would probably be that moment of seeing this book and just the humble confidence and trust in God and His providence in His way. We just make our petitions known, and on a day-to-day basis of being able to grow in that faith. That might be a little bit off the mark, maybe a little wayward from the answer that Amy was looking for, but there we go. That's what was in my mind.
It's a good name for the podcast then.
Yeah, there we go. So Dean Ham, a question for you here. Of all the courses, Nick, you took in university, what was your favorite and why?
Oh, gosh. Well, I had quite a few favorites, so this might take a while. I would have to say there was one course that, there were two courses in particular.
There were three.
There were three, and then there were three, yeah. One course I took in particular that influenced me was by a little guy named Father Dennis Greco. Looked a lot like Danny DeVito. Got mistaken for him one time too by a famous actor as well. That's another story. He taught a course called Beauty and Belief, or the way. Yeah, it's very similar to your Way of Beauty course. And we read through Chesterton. We read through a bunch of works on art, Michelangelo. Yeah, and Gerard Manley Hopkins. Really changed my perspective on things. Another course I took was Medieval Theology and Philosophy with another professor, and that was one where I really started to see the cathedral of theology, just in a way I'd never seen it before, and where a lot of passions started being developed. And it got me, I think, onto this track where I am today, just trying to grapple with these ideas and trying to have their consequences and their good fruits come out for life in my students. So I'll just say those two. I could talk forever about that, though. Yeah. So here's one for you, Jim, and this is perhaps less serious, but interesting nonetheless, by Felicia Vandermeer. Would you rather be transported permanently, 100 years into the future or 100 years into the past?
I'd rather not be transported permanently anywhere than the now.
But that's not the question.
That's not the question. Would I rather? To quote Abby Cronin, I think maybe no. 100 years past, 100 years into the future. If I had to make a choice, I would flip a coin, leaving it up to the Holy Spirit.
Okay.
I know that's not a good answer.
So you wouldn't make a choice.
I wouldn't make a choice. No, I think there's something that is attractive about both and not attractive about either. So I would remain in a state of indecision in the present moment permanently. How about that?
Okay.
Does that work?
Sure. I'm not going to pressure you too much about it.
Felicia's coming out with some funny ones, so I got one more for you from Felicia. Okay. Here we go, okay? And this is kind of the same track. Would you rather have unlimited sushi for life or unlimited tacos for life?
Oh my gosh.
Now, this is Felicia, so I'm fairly certain that there's some deep theological implications to this. Sushi or tacos?
Well, tacos are closer to Our Lady of Guadalupe, so sure, tacos.
Tacos it is. There we go. I was wondering, is that this life or is it eternal life, eternal tacos?
Oh, well then, no, I'm just kidding. Tacos.
Yeah. I would choose the answer from St. Therese on that one. I choose
all. Yeah, that's right. That's right. Well, I guess it comes down to part of the show where we try and figure out who has the last word. Okay, so
rock, paper, scissors. Oh, well, sorry, Nick. It's mine again. Well, I want to thank you very much for joining us again. This has been good fun. Nick, I want to thank you for carrying a big part of the conversation, your beautiful insights in leisure and contemplation. Clearly something that has deeply impacted you in your studies of Joseph Pieper. So thank you for sharing those. Hope you have a very blessed and holy week. This is going to be a different one. Stay very, very close to the Holy Spirit, listening and attentive, and He will lead you. Remember that while we may seem to be very separated and disconnected, we remain in communion in the Eucharist, and we will certainly see you there. Know that you're in our prayers, our thoughts, and our hearts. And again, thanks, Nick. Thank you. And as always, here we are, Nick and Jim, doing little well. God bless you.